Some people say a dog is just a dog. But what if I told you sometimes a dog saves a life not just once, but every single day? On this episode of Veil Marks, we're about to dive into a story that may stir debate. Do animals truly feel like we do? Can they understand pain, loyalty, love? Or are we simply projecting human emotion onto instinct? This isn't just a tale about a dog and a boy. It's about what happens when two forgotten souls find each other and change everything. Stay with us till the end. This story holds a powerful lesson you won't want to miss. The wind drifted through the trees of the Vermont hillside, rustling the amber leaves like whispers from an old storybook. At the far edge of the Parker family's property, just beyond the wooden fence, and nestled under the wide branches of a weathered maple tree, sat a boy still, silent, small. Ethan Parker was 9 years old. 2 years earlier, he had fallen from the second-story window of their home. The accident had taken much from him: his voice, his ability to walk, and slowly, day by day, it seemed to have taken pieces of his spirit too. He hadn't spoken since. He hadn't run, played, or even smiled in what felt like forever. Each afternoon, Megan, his mother, would wheel his chair beneath the old maple tree, the same tree he used to climb when he was younger and whole. She would kiss the top of his head, brush his brown curls gently aside, and then leave him there for a while, in case the wind or the rustling leaves could say the things he no longer could. He sat there for hours watching clouds move, birds pass, the distant shimmer of the forest. There was a haunting stillness in him, the kind that grown-ups recognized but never knew how to fix. Then one day, just as the light began to shift to that golden, late autumn hue, something stirred at the edge of the woods. At first, it was just the sound, a soft crunching of leaves, the faint snap of twigs underfoot. Ethan's head turned slowly. From the tree line, a large gray figure emerged, limping slightly, its body low and alert. It was a Pitbull, thick-shouldered, scarred down one side, and moving with a heavy drag in its left hind leg. Its coat was a dusky mix of slate and ash, with deep eyes that flickered somewhere between caution and sorrow. A dog like that, alone and wounded, would have made most people step back. And later, that's exactly what Megan did when she saw it. But Ethan didn't move. He didn't blink or recoil. Instead, he extended his hand, not quickly, not fearfully, but with a kind of quiet certainty. The dog paused, its muscles tensed, eyes locked with the boy's. Seconds passed like whole minutes. Then the dog lowered its head and sat. Megan saw it all from the kitchen window and nearly dropped the mug in her hand. Her heart leapt into her throat as she bolted outside, her voice rising in panic. "Ethan." She rushed toward him, her instincts flaring with fear. This was a strange dog, a pit bull, injured, unpredictable, and her child, so fragile and wordless, was reaching for it. But as she drew closer, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. The boy's fingers rested lightly on the dog's forehead. The pit bull didn't flinch. Its tail gave a single, soft wag. They were frozen in a kind of sacred moment, two beings whose pain had rendered them outsiders, now sharing a breath beneath the branches of a maple tree. Megan's breath caught. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan wasn't just sitting in silence. He was present, alert. His eyes weren't distant. They were connected. She didn't call animal control that day. Instead, they watched the dog return the next afternoon, and the day after, always the same time, always to the same place. It became part of their routine. The dog would appear from the trees, sit beside Ethan, and remain there without a sound. The two didn't play in the traditional sense. There were no games of fetch, no rolling in grass, but there was an unspoken companionship between them, a stillness that no one dared interrupt. The family began calling him Diesel, after the old truck that James, Ethan's father, had loved so much when he was a boy. Built tough, a little beat up, but still runs on loyalty, James had said with a quiet chuckle. Diesel never entered the house. He never ventured beyond the edge of the yard. But every day, when Ethan was wheeled out to his tree, Diesel would emerge, sometimes limping worse than usual, sometimes with fresh scrapes, but always with that same gaze, as if guarding something precious. Neighbors whispered, Some warned the Parkers that Pitbulls were dangerous, unpredictable. But Ethan had made a decision in that first silent handshake, and it was as if Diesel had agreed. James, cautious at first, found himself observing the dog from the porch with folded arms and furrowed brow. Megan, though still wary, began leaving out a bowl of water near the tree. Just in case, she'd say. And Ethan began to come back to life, if only a little. His eyes tracked the dog's movements. His hands rested longer on Diesel's head. Sometimes he'd make soft tapping patterns on the armrest of his chair, and Diesel would perk up, ears twitching, as if he understood. It wasn't a miracle, not the kind in fairy tales, but in a house where silence had grown louder than words, even the quiet rhythm of Diesel's breath beside Ethan's was enough to make hearts believe again. What no one could explain, what neither science nor therapy had managed in 2 years, was how a scarred, forgotten dog and a voiceless, broken boy had found each other in the stillness of an October afternoon, and neither of them had been the same since. Long before Diesel became a silent guardian beneath a maple tree, he was something else entirely, a hero in uniform, wearing a vest with 9 rescue unit stitched across his muscular frame. He once charged through the wreckage of collapsed buildings, sniffed out survivors buried under rubble, and stood tall beside firefighters in disasters most people only saw on the news. Diesel had been trained to go where it was dangerous, where human feet hesitated. He didn't just follow commands, he followed instincts, and his instincts were almost always right. His last mission had been in Florida. A hurricane had ripped through the coast, leaving homes flattened like paper boxes. In the aftermath, Diesel and his handler were dispatched to search for survivors. That day, amid the roar of sirens and the stench of gasoline and broken timber, Diesel had dug his way into the wreckage of a collapsed home where a little girl's cries were barely audible. His handler couldn't reach her, but Diesel could. He found her pinned under 2 broken beams, her tiny hands gripping a soaked teddy bear. Diesel crawled in, nudging her face, staying by her side until help arrived. He didn't leave, even when a second structure gave way above him. That's when it happened, his hind leg crushed by falling debris. They pulled him out, injured but alive. For a while, he was treated like the hero he was. There were photos, handshakes, even a plaque. But as weeks passed, something inside Diesel changed. He started flinching at loud sounds. He snarled at alarms. The once razor-sharp focus that made him a model working dog had frayed into something unpredictable. The department said he was no longer field fit. They used words like trauma, aggression, liability, and just like that, Diesel was retired unwanted, misunderstood, discharged not with honor, but caution. He was handed off from shelter to shelter, his history lost behind a file of warnings. Reactive, one report said. Should not be placed near children, said another. But someone did remember him. Mr. Ray Dalton had trained dozens of dogs during his years as a 9 handler and instructor. He'd seen the best and worst of them, loyalty beyond comprehension, and sometimes heartbreak that ran deeper than any wound. Diesel had been his pride. Tough, responsive, alert, with a nose that could catch a scent in a storm and a loyalty that never wavered. Ray had long since retired, trading the chaos of sirens and deployments for a quiet cabin on the edge of Oak Ridge Hills, a few ridges away from the Parkers. He lived alone now. No wife. No kids. Just a wood stove, an old rocking chair, and a porch with a view of the valley. Locals called him Grumpy. He was the kind of man who hollered at kids for riding bikes too fast past his mailbox, and once threatened to hose down a group of teenagers for setting off fireworks near his fence. But when Ray heard rumors about a gray Pitbull limping near the maple tree in the Parkers' backyard, quiet, calm, and never barking, he had a hunch. He dusted off an old photo of Diesel and himself, taped to a metal plaque inside a drawer. Then he walked the ridgeline until he saw for himself. And there he was, Diesel, lying beside a boy in a wheelchair, his head resting on the boy's lap. The boy wasn't talking. He didn't even seem to move much. But they were connected. There was something in the way Diesel looked at the child, not with tension or fear, but with recognition. Ray didn't call out. He just stood there, watching the boy's fingers gently tap a rhythm on Diesel's back and Diesel's tail give the slightest flick in response. The old man swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "I thought they gave up on you," Ray whispered. "But you found your own mission, didn't you?" The next day, Ray came back, this time with treats in his pocket. Though Diesel didn't need bribing, he recognized Ray immediately, stood up on all fours limping, yes, but with eyes wide and focused like old times. "You remember me, don't you?" Ray said softly. Diesel leaned his head into the man's chest, and for the first time in years, Ray allowed himself to kneel, his knees cracking, his hands shaking to wrap his arms around a dog he once believed was lost to trauma. That afternoon, Ray spoke to Ethan's parents. He explained Diesel's past, how he used to rescue people, how he got hurt, and how the system cast him aside. James listened intently. Megan watched Ethan from the kitchen window. "Look at them," she said softly, eyes moist. "They're healing each other." Ray nodded. "That boy sees what most people don't. Diesel's not broken. He's just waiting for someone worth protecting." From then on, Ray became part of the daily rhythm. He didn't intrude, didn't hover, but every few days he'd walk down the ridge, carrying old toys Diesel once loved, or just sitting on the bench near the tree. He watched Diesel and Ethan, never interrupting the silence they shared, because he understood its value. Diesel never barked, never chased squirrels, never begged for food. He just sat beside Ethan, always alert, always calm, always present. When the wind picked up and the leaves fluttered around them, he'd lift his head and lean gently against Ethan's side, as if to say, "I'm here. You're not alone." And under the fading autumn sky, an old soldier, a quiet child, and a misunderstood dog formed a bond that needed no words, no explanation, only trust. Because sometimes, the ones who've been forgotten by the world find each other. There's something sacred about quiet moments, those soft pauses in life where words aren't necessary, where glances and gestures say enough. In the Parker household, silence had long been a haunting thing, a space filled with absence and ache. But lately, something had changed. The quiet hadn't disappeared, but it had softened. It had begun to carry new meaning. It started subtly. Every afternoon, when Diesel arrived and curled beside Ethan's wheelchair under the maple tree, Ethan began tapping his fingers gently against the armrest. Tap, tap, pause, tap. It wasn't random. It followed a rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. Diesel, in return, would twitch an ear or lift his head in response, sometimes shifting closer so Ethan's hand could rest lightly on his back. No one had taught them this. It wasn't from a book or a doctor's plan. It was theirs. A language built on presence and trust. A boy who couldn't speak, and a dog who didn't need to. Megan noticed first. She'd stopped hovering, but she often watched from the kitchen window, holding a steaming mug in her hands. She rarely sipped. At first, she thought the tapping was just a nervous tick, some small, meaningless movement. But when she looked closer, she saw the way Diesel responded, how he always turned his head, how he adjusted his position so Ethan's fingers could graze the soft patch of fur near his shoulder. It was like they were talking. Not in sentences, but in something quieter, deeper. She began writing it down. At first, just as a mother clinging to hope, 1:10 p.m., Ethan tapped. Diesel looked. But as days passed, the notes grew more detailed. She noted the consistency, the timing, the expressions on Ethan's face. One day, she wrote something she hadn't dared put to paper in years. Ethan smiled. She wasn't sure at first. It had been so long since she'd seen it that her memory had begun to blur. But there it was, just a soft lift at the corner of his mouth as Diesel playfully nudged a pine cone toward him. Megan gasped, dropped her notepad, and ran outside barefoot. She knelt beside Ethan and cupped his face in her hands. "You smiled," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. "Baby, you smiled." Ethan didn't react much, but his eyes softened and his hand rested more firmly on Diesel's back. Megan stayed there for a long time, soaking it in the boy who hadn't laughed in 2 years, letting the sun warm his face, surrounded by leaves and loyalty. Ray had started visiting more often, though he never stayed too long or talked too much. He would bring small things, an old rubber ball from Diesel's working days, a worn-out 9 vest, or sometimes just a thermos of coffee and a seat on the porch. He didn't press himself into their lives, but he fit into the edges of it, like a puzzle piece you didn't realize was missing. And he brought stories. Not the kind from fairy tales, but real ones, gritty, honest, sometimes a little too painful. One crisp afternoon, as Diesel lay stretched in the sun, and Ethan sat beside him, Ray pulled up a folding chair and began to speak. You know, he said, his voice raspy but steady, Diesel had a partner once. Another dog. Smaller. A little mutt, really. Name was Buck. Ethan turned his head slightly, watching. Buck wasn't the fastest, or the strongest, but man, could he sniff. Saved 6 people during a gas explosion in New Orleans. And during a tornado in Kansas, he didn't make it out. Ray's voice caught for a moment, and he looked away toward the trees. He stayed back to help a child stuck under debris. Saved her life. But a second collapse came too fast. We couldn't get to him. Ethan didn't blink. He didn't look down. His hand reached out and touched Diesel's ear, gently. That was the first time I cried in uniform, Ray said quietly. He looked over and saw something in Ethan's expression, understanding. The kind that doesn't come from words, but from shared experience. A boy who had lost more than most adults could bear, and a man who had buried too many good souls, canine and human alike. Somehow they understood each other. Diesel, despite his strength and his calm, still had moments of weakness. Sometimes it was a sound, a siren from the fire station in town, or a distant motorcycle engine. Other times it was something visual, like flashing lights from a neighbor's party. In those moments he'd tremble, paws twitching, tail low. His eyes would dart, searching for something safe. And Ethan would reach out. A soft touch on the shoulder, a flat palm against the dog's ribs. He never said a word, never panicked, never needed to be told. Just presence. Stillness. A boy who knew exactly what it felt like to come undone. The first time Megan saw it, she cried again, but quietly this time, from the window. It was strange, watching her son so small, so fragile, become a calming force for something as strong and powerful as Diesel. But it made sense, too. In their brokenness, they had found balance. Even James, usually the quiet one, began staying outside longer. He started joining Ethan and Diesel under the maple tree after work, sitting on the ground despite his sore knees. He didn't say much either, but sometimes he'd toss a stick lazily or simply rest a hand on his son's shoulder. And slowly, the Parker household began to change. It wasn't loud. There weren't sudden miracles, but there were more meals eaten together, more evenings spent outside, more soft smiles exchanged. The silence that had once weighed heavy on the house now felt like something sacred, a place where healing was quietly taking root. One afternoon, Ray leaned against the porch rail, coffee in hand, and watched Ethan gently braid a few long blades of grass into Diesel's collar. You know, he said to Megan, sometimes the best therapy in the world walks on 4 legs. Megan nodded, her voice catching in her throat. I think Ethan would say the same. If he could, Ray took a sip, his eyes glistening. Oh, he already has. And beneath the maple tree, where shadows danced and leaves whispered above their heads, a boy who had forgotten how to smile, and a dog who had been told he was no longer useful, sat side by side healing each other, one silent afternoon at a time. The early spring sun had just begun to warm the forest floor when Megan wheeled Ethan down the path behind their home, past the towering pine trees, and toward the narrow trail that wound along the old creek. The snowmelt had given life back to the stream, and its cold waters rushed gently over smooth stones, carrying away the last signs of winter. It was Ethan's favorite place. There was something mesmerizing about watching the current dance and curl, something peaceful about the way the trees whispered above. Megan usually stayed close, but that day, with Diesel by his side and the trail dry enough to roll across safely, she gave them a few moments alone. Just a few. Ethan sat quietly in his chair near the edge of the creek, his eyes fixed on the glittering surface. Diesel lay at his side, ears alert, tail still, as if sensing the boy's desire to be close to the water. And then, slowly, Ethan reached forward. His hand stretched out, not enough to touch the stream, just enough to lean, just enough to shift the balance. He didn't realize the ground was softer there, the bank weakened by melting ice beneath. The moment the front wheels of his chair edged closer, the dirt crumbled. In a flash, the chair tilted forward and tumbled. Ethan's body fell with it, down into the small ravine. It wasn't far, just 6 feet, maybe less. But for a child who couldn't walk, who couldn't call for help, it might as well have been a canyon. His back hit the cold ground hard. The breath left his lungs. The wheelchair toppled beside him, twisted and useless. His eyes wide, Ethan looked up, terrified, stunned. No voice came. He couldn't scream. He couldn't move. His mouth opened, but there was no sound, just the stream, still rushing beside him as if nothing had happened. Diesel barked. A single, sharp cry at first. Then another. Then a flurry of desperate, explosive barks that echoed through the trees. He ran in circles around the rim of the ravine, looking down, barking, then back up, as if willing Ethan to respond. His body was electric with panic, his nails digging into the soft earth. He barked again, more urgently, his voice slicing through the forest like an alarm bell. Then he ran. Diesel tore through the trees, faster than he'd moved in months, his injured leg dragging but never slowing him. His path was direct and unrelenting, cutting through brush and fallen branches until he reached the clearing behind Ray Dalton's cabin. Ray was out front, trimming the edges of his small garden, his headphones on, humming along to an old Johnny Cash track. He didn't hear Diesel approach, didn't hear anything at all until he felt a sudden tug on the hem of his flannel shirt. Startled, he looked down and saw the Pitbull clamped gently to his sleeve, eyes blazing with panic. Diesel released him only to bark wildly, then dart toward the trees, then back again, circling Ray, barking and yanking at his sleeve once more. "What is it?" Ray muttered, pulling off his headphones. "What's wrong?" But the dog didn't stop. He ran a few steps into the woods, then turned back, whining, barking, tugging. It was more than behavior. It was communication. Ray's gut twisted. He dropped the shears, grabbed his jacket, and followed. Whatever this was, it wasn't nothing. Minutes later, Ray arrived at the ravine, and what he saw knocked the wind from his lungs. Diesel was on his belly, stretched at the edge of the pit, his head thrust forward, peering down like a sentry on high alert. His ears twitched at every sound Ethan made, every soft gasp, every labored breath. And Ethan was lying twisted on the ground, his face pale, his lips moving in silence, his small hand barely reaching toward the steep bank above. "Ethan!" Ray shouted before turning back toward the house. By the time James and Megan arrived, sprinting breathlessly through the brush behind Ray, Diesel hadn't moved an inch. He lay low to the earth, tail rigid, his body guarding the boy below like a soldier at post. James didn't hesitate. He dropped to the ground, slid down into the ravine, and scooped his son into his arms. "I've got you, buddy," he whispered, voice cracking. As James lifted Ethan carefully, Diesel gave a low, guttural sound, not of threat, but of fierce devotion. He leaned into Ethan's side, nudging him gently, sharing warmth with his body, refusing to leave until the boy was safe in his father's arms. Only then, when Ethan was cradled tightly against James's chest and carried up the slope, did Diesel step back. But even then, his eyes never left Ethan, not for a second. And as the family hurried back toward the house, hearts pounding and breaths shallow, Diesel followed close behind, silent now, but alert, every muscle ready, his purpose reignited. Whatever fear had once lived in him had burned away. His instincts, his training had never left. They had only waited for someone worth protecting. The ride to the hospital felt like a blur wrapped in panic. Megan sat in the back of the ambulance, holding Ethan's hand with both of hers, trying not to lose control. His skin was cold, his breath shallow. The paramedic worked quickly, checking vitals, placing an oxygen mask over the boy's face. Repeating short instructions, Megan barely heard. James followed behind in the car, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Diesel was in the passenger seat, leaning against the door, his eyes locked on the ambulance ahead as if willing it to go faster. When they reached the hospital, the emergency room doors burst open, and the paramedics rushed Ethan inside. Doctors and nurses moved with practiced urgency, wheeling the small, still figure away as Megan tried to keep up. A nurse gently stopped her. "We'll take care of him. Please wait here," and just like that, they were separated. Diesel tried to follow, but was stopped at the threshold. For a moment, it looked like he might growl, but instead, he simply sat right at the entrance to the emergency room and didn't move. His eyes were sharp, unblinking, fixed on the double doors that had just swallowed Ethan. No one dared chase him off. The staff asked about the dog. A security guard muttered something about regulations, but when he approached, Diesel let out a low, warning whine, not hostile, not aggressive, but unmistakably protective. The guard backed off. "He's not going anywhere," James said quietly. "Not until that boy comes back through those doors." Megan sat beside Diesel, one hand resting on his shoulder, drawing comfort from the steady rise and fall of his breath. For 2 hours, they waited like that, in silence, in stillness, in hope. Finally, a young doctor emerged, pulling down her surgical mask as she approached. "He's stable," she said. It was mild hypoxia oxygen deprivation. If he'd been out there another 10 minutes, we could have been looking at brain damage or worse. "But you got him here just in time." Megan nearly collapsed with relief. James placed a hand over his face, hiding the tears he could no longer hold back. But the doctor wasn't finished. "There's something unusual, though," she said, glancing toward Diesel. "When we first began treatment, Ethan's heart rate was spiking. We administered oxygen, medication, all according to protocol. But nothing was working." She hesitated. Then we heard barking. Megan's eyes widened. "Diesel! He wasn't even in the room," the doctor said. But the moment that barking reached the hallway, Ethan's vitals started to stabilize. "I can't explain it. It doesn't make scientific sense." But it was as if he heard it, and it calmed him. Later that afternoon, Dr. Sandra Sanders arrived at the hospital. A veterinarian with over 30 years of experience in working dogs, she had known Diesel from his days in active service. She had treated him for his PTSD, tracked his discharge, and had quietly followed his story ever since. When she saw Diesel sitting by the door, she stopped in her tracks. The same dog who once couldn't be near alarms without panicking was now sitting, calmly, loyally, waiting for a boy he had known for only a few months. "I never thought I'd see this again, Doctor," Sanders said, kneeling beside him. "This isn't just instinct, it's devotion." The hospital staff stood back, watching the interaction in silence. "You see," she explained to Megan and James, "Diesel was trained to protect. But what no one teaches what they can't is this level of connection. He's not just responding to commands. He's sensing something deeper. This boy, your son, he's become Diesel's mission." They nodded slowly, still taking it all in. The following days were a mixture of slow recovery and quiet awe. Ethan remained in a private room, his body resting, healing. Diesel never left the hallway outside. Staff brought him water, a blanket, even bits of turkey from the cafeteria. Every few hours, James or Megan would sit with him. So would Ray, who showed up on the second day and stayed for hours without saying much. But on the third morning, something changed. Megan had stepped into Ethan's room, just as a nurse was checking the fourth. Ethan was awake, still tired, still pale, but alert. She rushed to his side, her heart leaping. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "you're okay." "You're okay?" Ethan blinked slowly and lifted his hand. Not much, but just enough to signal. His fingers moved with care, forming letters in the air, one at a time. D-I-E-S-E-L. Megan covered her mouth. The nurse gasped. She stepped into the hall, her voice shaking. "He's asking for the dog." Without a word, Diesel stood. No one called him. No one had to. The staff made room as he walked slowly into the room, his paws quiet on the tile floor. He approached the bed and rested his chin beside Ethan's hand. The boy's fingers moved gently through his fur. No barking. No panic. Just breath. Just presence. The entire room went still. No one spoke. Even the machines, for a moment, seemed quieter. What medical science had struggled to restore, what therapies and years of silence had failed to reach, this connection had touched. And for those watching, it was impossible to explain. But it was real. In a sterile room filled with beeping monitors and laminated charts, a boy who couldn't speak and a dog who didn't need to had shared something no test could measure. Healing had taken root not in the body, but in the space between two souls who had once been lost and found each other. The hospital stay had changed them all. Not just Ethan, though his recovery had brought light back into his eyes, but also James and Megan, and even Ray, the man who had spent most of his later years on the edges of other people's lives. And Diesel, of course. The dog who had once been cast aside now sat at the center of everything. When Ethan was discharged, the nurses lined the hallway. Not because it was protocol, but because they wanted to see it for themselves, this boy who had arrived near death and silent, now awake and reaching for the dog who never left his side. Diesel walked beside the wheelchair as if he had trained for it, though no one had taught him. His pace matched Ethan's exactly. His head stayed low, alert. James pushed the chair slowly, one hand always resting on his son's shoulder. Megan walked just behind them, holding back tears with each step. Outside, the sunlight felt brighter than they remembered. The air smelled like fresh earth and new beginnings. But something lingered in James's mind, something he hadn't said out loud until they were nearly home, the forest once again rolling past the windows. He glanced in the rearview mirror at Diesel, who lay stretched out beside Ethan in the back seat. The boy's hand rested in the soft gray fur behind the dog's ear. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but certain. "We can't send him away." Megan looked over. She didn't need clarification. "You mean Diesel?" James nodded. "He's not just part of this. He is this. This healing. This family. Ethan doesn't just need him, he understands him. And Diesel understands him back," Megan swallowed. "What about Ray?" James hesitated, then said the words that had been growing in his chest. Since the first time, he saw Ray watching Ethan and Diesel under the maple tree. "He should be with us too." Megan turned in her seat. "You mean live with us?" James looked back at the road. "He doesn't have anyone. And Ethan. Ethan doesn't just need Diesel. He needs someone who knows how Diesel thinks, how he reacts. Someone who sees what we can't. Someone like Ray." The decision was made before they pulled into the driveway. That evening, they invited Ray over under the pretense of a thank you dinner. Megan cooked more than usual, setting out the good plates. James lit the lanterns on the porch. Ethan waited at the table, a small folded card on his lap. Ray arrived, skeptical as always, dressed in his usual flannel and boots, Diesel at his side. They ate in the soft glow of dusk. There was laughter, quiet at first, then warm and easy. It wasn't the kind that comes from jokes, but from something deeper, shared survival, hard-won hope. After dessert, James cleared his throat. "We've been thinking," he began, looking at Ray, "about everything you've done for Ethan, for Diesel, and for us." Ray shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Compliments weren't his thing. James continued, "We want you to stay. Not for dinner, for good. Move in. Be part of this, whatever this is now." Ray stared at him, stunned. "You want me to live here?" Megan reached across the table. "We've got a spare room in the back. It's not much, but it's yours if you want it." Ethan turned his head, then handed the folded card to Ray. Inside, in shaky handwriting, were 6 block letters. GUARDPOST. Below it, a small sketch of a room with a bed, a chair, and 2 figures. 1 dog, 1 man. Ray stared at the drawing, his lips trembling. "I haven't been called family in a long time," he said hoarsely, setting the card down. "Not since my brother passed." James stood and placed a hand on Ray's shoulder. "Well," he said simply, "you are now." That weekend, the family cleaned out the back room. It had once been storage filled with old boxes and unused tools. But with some work, a coat of paint, and a worn leather armchair Ray had insisted on bringing from his cabin, it became something new. Ethan called it the guard post. It wasn't just a bedroom. It was a sanctuary, a lookout, a place of safety for those who had been forgotten by the world and had found purpose again. Diesel settled in instantly. He had his bed by the window, where he could see the front yard and the tree line beyond. At night, he curled up beside Ethan's bed, but every morning he would trot down the hall and sit by Ray's door, tail thumping once, waiting for the old man to stir. The rhythm of the household changed, slowly but naturally. James began spending more time on the porch with Ray, talking about woodworking and old tools. Megan shared stories over coffee in the mornings, and Ethan, day by day, found new ways to communicate not with words, but through expression, gestures, trust. Their family was no longer three. It was five. And though none of them could have predicted it, a boy, a dog, a retired nine trainer, and two parents trying their best, what they had built together was something rare, something quiet and unbreakable. A family not born by blood, but by choice. And in the quiet hours of evening, when the maple leaves rustled in the wind and the porch lights cast a golden hue across the yard, anyone who passed by might see them all gathered there, talking, laughing, being, and feel, even for a moment, that the world could be soft again. Late afternoon sunlight spilled across the grass like honey, warm and golden. The maple tree behind the Parker home, once stark and bare, now stood in full bloom, its green leaves whispering softly in the breeze, casting dappled shadows across the yard. Spring had come to Oak Ridge Hills, and with it, something else had returned, stillness, but not the aching kind that used to hover over this home. This stillness was peaceful, full, alive. Ethan sat at the edge of the porch, his wheelchair parked just slightly askew. He'd been outside all afternoon, refusing to go in, even when the wind picked up. Megan had offered him a blanket, but he'd shaken his head. He liked the way the sun felt on his skin now. It was a language of warmth, the kind he didn't need to speak to understand. Beside him, as always, lay Diesel. The dog had grown leaner with the daily walks and stronger with each run through the field, but he was still the same gray-eyed, silent, steady. His coat had lost the dullness it once carried, now glinting under the sun. If you looked closely, you could see a small patch of fur over his left hip that never fully grew back from the old injury. It didn't seem to matter to him, or to Ethan. That afternoon, something shifted. With his parents watching from the kitchen window, and Mr. Ray seated a few feet away on the porch bench, Ethan did something no one expected. He leaned forward. It was slow, almost imperceptible at first. A small shift in his posture, then a flex in his fingers as they gripped the armrests of the wheelchair. Megan pressed her hands to her mouth. James stepped forward, eyes wide. Then, using every ounce of strength in his upper body, Ethan lifted himself. It wasn't far, just a few inches. A rise from the chair, a controlled lean forward, but it was enough. Enough to reach Diesel's head with both hands. He rested them there, trembling but sure, his fingers pressing gently into the soft fur behind the dog's ears. Diesel didn't move. He simply closed his eyes and let out a deep, audible sigh, the kind that sounded like a long-awaited breath, like gratitude. If dogs could smile, that was exactly what Diesel was doing. From the porch bench, Ray watched in silence, his weathered hands busy adjusting the leather collar around Diesel's neck, making sure it fit just right. He said nothing, but the way he looked at Ethan, steady, soft, proud, said all that needed saying. No words were exchanged. There never had been many in this story, and that was the beauty of it. They didn't make promises to each other. Not Ethan to Diesel, not Ray to Ethan, not even the family to one another. But every day, in small ways, they showed up. Through shared meals, afternoon walks, evening stories. Through bandaged knees and muddy paw prints. Through laughter and setbacks. Through silence. And in that consistency, a vow had formed, unspoken but unbreakable. Diesel had once been labeled unfit, unstable, too broken to serve. Ray had been dismissed as bitter, grumpy, too alone to belong. Ethan had been deemed unreachable, trapped in a quiet world no one could enter. But together, they had rewritten those labels. Ethan's therapists called it a miracle. They said no one had expected that much progress in such little time. He wasn't walking yet, but his core strength had returned. He was using his hands more, communicating through more signs, more gestures, even attempting vocalization on quiet mornings when he thought no one was listening. And through it all, Diesel remained his anchor. At school, kids no longer looked at Ethan with pity. They waved at Diesel, asked to pet him. And when Ethan smiled even just a flicker, it wasn't because someone asked him to. It was because he wanted to. Mr. Ray had settled into the back room they'd made for him, the one Ethan had named Guard Post. Every morning, Ethan rolled down the hall and knocked twice before coming in. Ray would always say, "Right on time, soldier," and hand him a warm muffin or a story about his younger days with the 9 unit. They had routines now. Shared silence. Inside jokes that needed no words. Megan often said their home didn't feel like a house anymore. It felt like a heart beating, imperfect, alive. That golden evening, as the sun began to dip low behind the hills and the air cooled with the promise of night, Ethan slowly lowered himself back into his chair. He gave Diesel one last pat on the head. The dog leaned into the touch, then laid his head across Ethan's lap. No camera could have captured that moment, not truly. It wasn't a triumph with medals or applause. It was something quieter, more sacred. Healing, after all, doesn't always come from pills or charts. Sometimes it arrives on 4 legs, wounded, misunderstood, but unwavering. And as the screen slowly fades to black, a final message appears quiet, white letters against the silence. Sometimes healing doesn't come from medicine. Sometimes it walks in on 4 legs, with a heart that never gave up. Then all is still again. But deep down, their story isn't over. It's just beginning. At Vale Marks, we believe stories like this are more than entertainment. They're a quiet echo of something real, compassion, healing, and second chances.